May 13, 1940. Sedan, France, on the banks of the Meuse River. By late afternoon, 7 German pontoon bridges stretched across water that French military planners had sworn no army could cross in force. General Heinz Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps had spent barely 2 days getting there, funneling through terrain the French High Command had marked on its maps as impassable for armor. The Ardennes forest. It wasn't impassable, it was simply undefended, because the French didn't believe tanks could move through it. By the time anyone in Paris understood what was happening, 3 Panzer divisions were already across the river, and the French Ninth Army holding that sector had begun to disintegrate. What broke that line wasn't just steel, it was noise. German Stuka dive bombers had been fitted with small wind-driven sirens on their landing gear. The Jericho Trumpet, a shrieking wail that built as the aircraft dove, purpose-built, to terrify troops and civilians who had never heard anything like it before. French reservists, who had held their positions through the first bombardments, broke and ran when the sound started, sometimes before a single bomb had fallen. Within 5 days, German armor had reached the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in half. Within 6 weeks, the campaign that French generals had assumed would take years, the way the last war had, was over. On June 22, 1940, France signed its surrender in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The same carriage, deliberately wheeled out of a museum on Hitler's personal order, in which Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was engineered as a public humiliation, and it worked. That's the part of this story most people already know. The terror, the speed, the 6-week collapse of a nation that had built the largest army in Western Europe. What most people don't know is what happened 4 days before France even fell. In a small room in London, when a British Prime Minister, barely 2 weeks into the job, sat down and decided that a defeated, disarmed, nearly invaded Ireland was still going to hit back. Before I tell you what Winston Churchill actually wrote in that memo, because it's more specific and more brutal than most retellings give it credit for, I want to ask you something, because this channel only works if the people watching it actually talk back. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. These stories exist because ordinary families lived through them, and I'd genuinely like to know who's on the other side of this screen. Now, back to London, June 1940. The last British troops had been pulled off the beaches at Dunkirk on June 2, 1940, leaving behind nearly all their heavy equipment on French sand. 4 days later, with the army he commanded effectively unarmed, and the Panzer divisions that had just crushed France, now staring across 21 miles of water at his coastline, Churchill sent a memo to his military secretary, General Hastings Ismay, that would quietly reshape how Britain fought the rest of the war. He didn't ask for a defensive plan. He wrote, "Enterprises must be prepared, with specially trained troops of the hunter class who can develop a reign of terror down these coasts. First of all on the butcher and bolt policy, leaving a trail of German corpses behind them." Read that next to what had just happened at Sedan, and the shape of this story becomes obvious. The Germans had spent 18 months building an army that terrified entire nations into surrender inside of 6 weeks. Britain, with almost nothing left to fight back with, decided its answer wasn't going to be a bigger army. It was going to be smaller, sharper, and designed to make the occupiers of Europe sleep badly every single night. Within days, the first commando units were forming. Within a year and a half, German coastal garrisons, the same military machine that had rolled through the Ardennes without slowing down, would start filing reports describing something they hadn't planned for at all. Small groups of British soldiers appearing out of the dark on their own coastline and disappearing before a proper counterattack could even be organized. The Panzer divisions had shown Europe what German steel could do to open ground. What happened next is the story of what a much smaller, much stranger British unit did to German nerves, and why, by 1942, the Wehrmacht was writing directives about an enemy most of its own generals had never taken seriously 12 months earlier, December 27, 1941. 0900 hours. Vagsøy Island, Norway, inside the Arctic Circle. The light cruiser HMS Kenya opened fire on the German coastal batteries at Molo at 8:48 that morning, and in the next 10 minutes, for its guns and 2 escorting destroyers, put somewhere between 400 and 450 shells into a position the German garrison believed was secure. Then the Commandos came ashore, roughly 570 men from Meuse, 2, 3, 4 Faun and 6 Commando, backed by a company of Norwegian volunteers who knew the ground personally, because it was theirs. What followed was not a clean raid. It was house-to-house fighting through a narrow fishing town, made worse when a Royal Air Force bomber, hit by German flak, dropped a phosphorus bomb almost directly onto one of the landing craft, killing or badly burning nearly half the men aboard. From the Germans in South Vagsøy were reinforced by 50 mountain troops. Gebirgsjäger, resting on leave from the Eastern Front, hardened men who fought back hard in the streets. The Commandos took losses, 17 killed, 53 wounded, including Captain Martin Linge, the Norwegian officer, the operation's later namesake, honors to this day. But by 2:45 that afternoon, with the objective achieved, for they were back on their landing craft and gone, taking with them 98 German prisoners, 4 Norwegian collaborators, and a complete German naval codebook. They'd killed at least 120 German personnel and burned the fish oil factories the Germans depended on for glycerine, a key ingredient in explosives manufacturing. By the numbers, Vagsøy was a mid-sized raid, smaller than what would come at St. Nazaire 3 months later, but its consequence, measured in what Adolf Hitler actually did afterward, was enormous. Hitler had already been anxious about Norway. He believed, wrongly but with total conviction, that Britain intended to invade the north of the country to pressure Sweden and Finland. Vagsøy confirmed his fear. Within weeks, he ordered roughly 30 additional troops diverted to Norwegian garrison duty. An entire theatre's worth of manpower redirected because of a single afternoon raid by fewer than 600 men. Field Marshal Siegmund List was sent north that February to assess the coastline. He came back recommending reinforcement on a massive scale. Colonel General Nicolaus von Falkenhorst, commanding in Norway, received not only the 12 additional troops he'd already requested before the raid, but another 18,000 men organized specifically into new fortress battalions. New coastal artillery replaced captured Russian and Belgian guns that had been considered adequate before December 27. By early 1942, 3 additional German divisional commands existed in Norway that hadn't existed a year earlier. An entire defensive build-up in a country Germany had already occupied without resistance, triggered by the psychological aftershock of one commando raid. That's the real answer, buried inside this story's title. It wasn't Panzer divisions that made the Wehrmacht redirect 30,000 men to guard an empty coastline. It was fear of what they couldn't predict. 3 months later, on the night of March 28, 1942, the pattern repeated at a scale that made Vagsøy look like a rehearsal. HMS Campbeltown, an obsolete destroyer disguised to resemble a German vessel, and packed with 4 tons of delayed action explosives, rammed the dry dock gates at St. Nazaire, the only facility on the French Atlantic coast large enough to service the German battleship Tirpitz. Around 600 sailors and commandos went ashore under Kapitän zur See, Karl Konrad Mecke's furious counterattack, fighting through machine gun fire in the docks and streets. Of the 611 men who sailed in, 469 were killed and 215 were taken prisoner. It was, by any conventional measure, a brutal, costly operation. And then, at 10:35 the next morning, while German officers were casually inspecting the wrecked Campbeltown lodged in their dock gates, it detonated. The explosion killed more than 300 German soldiers and dock workers instantly and destroyed the Normandy dock so completely that it never functioned again for the rest of the war, denying Tirpitz its only Atlantic repair facility and effectively keeping the most powerful battleship in the German Navy bottled up for the remainder of the conflict. Late that same evening, 2 more delayed torpedoes exploded near the U-boat pens, triggering a fresh wave of panic among German troops who believed a second wave of commandos was still hidden inside the port. Frightened sentries, convinced saboteurs were still among them, opened fire on French dockworkers, trying to flee the chaos, killing close to 250 of their own occupied population by mistake. By the spring of 1942, German High Command had learned 2 raids worth of the same lesson. Their coastline, guarded by the army that had conquered France in 6 weeks, was not secure from a few hundred men in the dark. What Adolf Hitler did with that realization, the order he would personally dictate 7 months later, is where this story turns from fear into something far darker. October 18, 1942. Berlin. Found. Adolf Hitler sat down and personally dictated a document he ordered, printed in exactly 12 copies. It went out under the highest secrecy classification the German High Command used, with explicit instructions that it must never fall into Allied hands. And it applied to every front, every theatre, every unit in German uniform anywhere in the world. It became known as the Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order, and its wording, later read into the record at the Nuremberg trials, left no room for interpretation. Any Allied commando encountered by German forces, whether armed or unarmed, whether fighting or trying to surrender, was to be killed on the spot. No prisoner status, no trial, no exception, even for a man with his hands raised. Sit with what that actually means. This was the same German military machine that had rolled Panzer divisions through the Ardennes in 4 days, and forced the surrender of France in 6 weeks. A military so confident in its own conventional dominance that it fought the opening of the war almost entirely by its own rulebook. And here was that same High Command, 2.5 years later, tearing up the laws of war it had otherwise mostly observed on the Western Front, specifically to deal with small teams of British raiders who kept showing up on beaches they were supposed to control. That's not a decision an army makes from strength, France. That's a decision an army makes when it has run out of other answers. The order didn't come from nowhere. WW2I had already pulled 30,000 troops away from other fronts to guard an Arctic coastline nobody thought needed guarding. And Nazaire had cost the Kriegsmarine its only Atlantic dry dock capable of servicing the Tirpitz, bottling up Germany's most powerful battleship for the rest of the war. And running parallel to the Commando Order was something even larger and more expensive. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's sprawling network of bunkers, gun emplacements, and beach obstacles that would eventually stretch across roughly 700 kilometers of coastline, from Norway to the Spanish border. Constructions accelerated sharply through 1942 and 1943, consuming enormous quantities of concrete, steel, and manpower that Germany desperately needed on the Eastern Front, where the real war for its survival was being decided at places like Stalingrad. Historians still debate exactly how much of that acceleration traces directly to commando raids versus the broader Allied invasion threat. But German planning documents from the period consistently name specific raids, WW2I and St. Nazaire among them, as direct triggers for reinforcing sectors previously judged low priority. Here's the actual, honest shape of what this title is asking about, without inflating it into something it wasn't. The Panzer divisions terrified France because they were fast, coordinated, and unstoppable in open, conventional battle. An army built to win exactly the kind of war it was fighting in May 1940. The Commandos unsettled Germany for the opposite reason. They weren't trying to win a conventional war at all. A raiding force of a few hundred men couldn't hold ground, couldn't defeat a Panzer division, couldn't win a campaign. What they could do was force an occupying army that controlled a continent to wander, every single night, along every mile of coastline it held. Whether tonight was the night a few dozen men in blackened faces climbed out of the dark. That uncertainty is expensive in a way tank battles aren't. It ties down 30,000 men in Norway who could have been fighting in Russia. It burns concrete and steel that could have gone to the Atlantic front instead. It produces a Führer directive so extreme it later becomes a war crimes charge at Nuremberg. Field Marshal Alfred Jodl would answer for the Commando Order at trial, among other charges, and he was hanged in October 1946. Panzer divisions won France by exploiting a gap in French doctrine, a belief that armor couldn't move through certain terrain fast enough to matter. The Commandos, in their own much smaller way, did something similar to the Germans. They exploited the gap between how much coastline an occupying army could physically hold and how much of it that army could actually watch, every night, forever. Neither side broke the other's core military strength doing this. Odd. What the Commandos broke was something quieter. The assumption that occupied Europe was ever fully secure. By the time the war ended, more than 25,000 men had passed through commando training at Archery, a brutal course built in the same spirit as Churchill's original 1940 memo. Most of them never appear in a single Wehrmacht file by name. But collectively, for the reason, a German high command that had conquered a continent in months spent the second half of the war writing directives, diverting divisions, and pouring concrete into a coastline it could never quite convince itself was safe. That's the real answer to why the same army that terrified France came to fear a few hundred men in the dark. And if this is the kind of history that actually interests you, the kind with real documents and real dates behind it, rather than just a dramatic voiceover, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone, and it shapes exactly what gets told next.